Hey everyone, I'm your host Cadence, and welcome back to another episode of Project Honesty, a podcast designed for young adults by a young adult to gain brutally honest, friend-like advice, as well as provide a platform for young adults to form opinions, color outside of the lines, take deep dives into current events, and most importantly, have fun. This is Project Honesty, navigating reality with real conversations and diverse opinions. If you haven't already, go check out last week's episode called Intelligence Redefined, the pros and cons of artificial intelligence. Over the last 24 years, huge advancements have been made to the world of artificial intelligence. With platforms like ChatGPT, what are the good things humans receive from our robot counterparts? In that episode, I dive into the history of AI technology, the uses of it, and the pros and cons about the industry. So please go check that out, and it's available on Spotify and YouTube. And so I have some news for you guys. We now have a website. I will try and put the link down below in the description for y'all to check it out. I spent over 2 months designing and customizing this website, staying up really late, trying to figure out the margins and everything, but I wanted to create this website as a home base for this podcast. The link for it is also in Project Honesty's Instagram bio, so project_honesty24. You should definitely head over there because that's also where we release every single weekly topic. So again, we have a new website. You can find it in link in bio on the Instagram, which is project_honesty24. Today's topic, it's going to be a little bit of a shorter episode, but I wanted to talk about the new cost of living. I want to talk about inflation, how it's impacting the livelihood of Canadian families, how minimum wage isn't currently matching the growth rate of inflation, and how inflation has started to affect the younger generation of people, so people like myself, and how our lives are quickly becoming much harder to afford. What is inflation? Inflation is the rate of which prices increase over a period of time. So it's a broad view of overall increased prices and overall living costs in a country. Canada right now has really high inflation rates. So all of our prices across a bunch of different categories have risen. Inflation can also be broken down and calculated in certain categories. So, for example, groceries and their increased prices over time. So when a country like Canada, for example, has high inflation rates, it means things like gas, housing, groceries, and other basic necessities become quickly out of reach and hard to budget. High inflation rates puts added pressure on households that have low income or fixed incomes, so people that are living off of government supports to afford their needs, specifically like people in low income housing, for example. And inflation is measuring the changes of the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI. Inflation happens for three main reasons. So first, we have cost push inflation. So this is consumer demands remain at a steady level, so a normal level, but supply cannot meet that regular demand. So an example of this, especially in Canada, is our inflated gas prices. I remember in Alberta, our gas used to be very, very cheap. I think it used to be able to get down to 80 cents a liter, but now it's over 100 consistently. So that's an example of what cost push inflation is. And then there's also something called demand pull inflation. So demand pull inflation is there's a rise in demand for certain services or products, but the economic supply cannot keep up with this demand. So the COVID pandemic is a great example of demand pull inflation. We saw this happening a lot, even with little things like toilet paper. There was a rise in demand for that, and we simply couldn't meet it. So that is demand pull inflation. And then one of the last kind of things of inflation is built-in inflation. This is where consumers are acclimatized to inflation rates, so they are kind of used to things being pricier. And so they're expecting an increase in their wage to upkeep their lifestyle. This increase of wages makes goods and services increasingly more expensive. So that is built-in inflation. So those three are kind of the main pillars of what we define as inflation. Overall, when a country or a person is faced with high inflation rates, the standard of living, regardless of one's socioeconomic status, will change. So some of these lifestyle changes become more drastic than others, and we will get into that in just a second. So what is inflation doing to Canadian families? One of the biggest kind of examples of this, and it's been a hot topic in Canadian political conversations, is the grocery prices. They are outrageous. Statistics taken from StatsCan says that an average family of 4 is predicted to spend over $16,000 yearly on groceries in 2024. That is around a $700 increase from the previous year, which is a lot of money. $700 is a lot of money. And so taking that, and that's just the average, like it will be different depending on the size of your family. How many people are you feeding? Like things like that. So grocery prices have been outrageous. And that leads a lot of people and a lot of Canadian families to start relying on food banks. So some of the most recent Canadian food bank statistics that I could get my hands on are from 2023. And so in March 2023, food banks across the country saw over 1.9 million visits. This is a 78% increase of users compared to March of 2019, pre-COVID. So you're seeing over a 50% increase in food bank users after the pandemic. And after the pandemic, it's been known that inflation has dramatically increased. Again, that's where you see a lot of families starting to rely on the food bank services because they simply can't afford groceries anymore. And a survey conducted by the Food Banks of Canada say that the top reasons why people are accessing food banks: increased food cost, as we know, so expensive groceries, even at the cheapest stores. Another reason is increased housing costs, so it's taking a lot more money to keep people sheltered compared to pre-COVID. And then there's also a problem with low wages. So low-income households can't keep up with the inflation rate and the rising cost of groceries, and so they have to start relying on food banks to provide them with the necessity of food. And this ties into inflation because inflation rates were at its highest they have ever been in over 40 years. So this is driving the housing market up as well, in addition to the increased cost of necessities. The leading cause of homelessness in Canada is financial stability. It has gotten worse over the last 4 years since COVID, but 41.8% of unsheltered people in Canada ended up on the streets because of financial troubles. This stat started to increase around 2022 and 2023 because of both high inflation rates as well as high interest rates. Kind of relating to last week's episode about AI technology, an AI company called Help Seeker, based out of Calgary, Alberta, predicted that overall homelessness rates will increase from, so the numbers that we're seeing right now is 150 to 300,000 homeless people in Canada in 2023, I'm pretty sure. And by 2030, this technology has predicted that those numbers will increase to around 550 to 570,000 people on the streets, which is a big problem, especially when inflation isn't really getting any better, interest rates aren't really getting any better, the unemployment rate is through the roof, the highest unemployment rate this country has seen in decades. And so that is kind of an alarm for concern. Overall, many Canadian families have also had to restrict their budget to only necessary things. Instead of being able to say, oh, let's go out for dinner this day, or let's go buy you a new shirt, or something like that, a lot of families now aren't able to do that because of these increased inflation rates. You might be wondering, what's happening with the minimum wage? Minimum wage in Canada means the lowest legal wage an employer can pay its employees. In Canada, that used to be an average of $15 across all provinces and territories. On April 1st of 2024, so of this year, Canada's federal government rose the minimum to $17.50 per hour to try to keep up with inflation as the CPI CPI had increased by 3.9% this year. The CPI, again, is the Consumer Price Index. And a lot are wondering, is this increase in minimum wage enough? Well, 90% of job seekers say that minimum wage should be able to keep up with rising inflation rates. 85% of those same job seekers say that increasing minimum wage carries long-term benefits for minimum wage workers. There are a lot of benefits with increasing minimum wage so that living is more affordable for those who work minimum wage jobs. But there is a lot of downsides that I previously didn't even know about when we start to have wages meeting inflation. And so some of these problems have a lot to do with businesses just across the country. So a lot of businesses, when they start to increase wages for their minimum wage workers, they refer to increased outsourcing, decreased working hours for their employees, and just an overall reduced workforce. Yes and no, minimum wage is keeping up. There's a lot of stuff in the media that I've seen that a lot of younger people, especially, cannot live off of one minimum wage job. They have to get 3, 4 even just to stay afloat. And so what does this all mean for the younger generations? That is something that's really important to talk about in here, especially since I'm a young person and I know that a lot of young people listen to this podcast. So it's really important to discuss this. So millennials and Gen Z have statistically been the hardest hit generation of inflation. Multiple surveys have shown that a lot of millennials and Gen Z have given up on their dream of owning a home one day due to skyrocketing housing costs. And almost half of the surveyed millennials and around 38% of Gen Z said they require a second job just to stay afloat. And another big problem that we're seeing a lot more now with this younger generation is that a lot of these people are actively trying to pay off student debt from going to school. Student loans and tuition have also increased around an average of 12.6% since 2010. Gen Z has also been moving out of their parents' houses a lot later than before because of unaffordable housing. And statistically, Gen Z is dealing with more debt than their parents ever did. Over 90%, I think it was around 97% of surveyed Gen Zs in 100 metropolitan areas stated that they are in debt. And this debt is non-mortgage debt, so meaning it's from school or from taking out loans. It's not even from trying to afford to buy a house or something. It's just general debt that they've incurred from trying to afford living. Though Gen Z is more likely to go to post-secondary, it's actually statistically proven that Gen Zs are more likely to go to post-secondary and work higher income jobs compared to millennials. Gen Z is also having to pay 31% more for housing compared to millennials. So the life that our parents had simply isn't feasible anymore with current inflation and interest rates. Our parents were able to afford houses younger, but now that it simply isn't possible for the majority of Gen Z workers and millennial workers. And the younger generations are having to modify their lives just to afford to stay afloat. The future of Gen Z and beyond, so even younger generations, is determined by affordability. Next time you go to the grocery store or the gas station, take a second to reflect on how prices have increased everywhere and what that means for you and your current state and also your future. I know this was a little bit of a shorter episode, but I really wanted to talk about this on here. So thank you so much for listening to another episode of Project Honesty. You can find Project Honesty on Spotify at Project Honesty or on YouTube at Project_Honesty. And to keep up to date with new episodes, you can head over to Project Honesty's Instagram, which is at Project_Honesty24. That is also in the Instagram bio. That is also where we keep our website link. We also have a TikTok, which is Project.Honesty. And to help spread this podcast everywhere, you can tell a friend or share with family about Project Honesty, and you can direct them over to the Instagram, the TikTok, the Spotify, YouTube, or the website to help them learn more. Remember to subscribe, follow, and click the bell icon for updates when I post. And remember, the more listeners, the bigger the family.